Hello, welcome to part 3 of my making of the Edie top. This is my third and final video in this series of me making this top. If you happen to have missed the first two, I will go ahead and link those here. In the first video, I show you how I cut out the pattern pieces, put the pattern together, the other way around. I show you how I put the pattern pieces together and then cut those out and then cut out my fabric from the pattern. In the second video, I show the entire process of how I block printed my fabric with my hand carved stamps. And in today's video, I will show you how I sew the whole thing together. And then the funnest part, which is showing the final garment. I really love how it turned out and I can't wait to show you my process. So without further ado, let's get into the sewing. So my first step is to check the pattern and make sure I know which step I'm on. And then I grab an awl and make holes where I know that I need to make marks. And then using a felt tip marker, I make marks everywhere that the pattern indicates I need to. Now I need to press the bias binding for the back opening, and this is a little tricky, and I think it's mostly because of the fabric I'm using. Because it's this 4-ply gauze, it's quite thick and a little tricky to press. Now I am lining up the spots where the darts go on the back piece and then going to press those in place. I imagine there are quite a few different ways of doing this. This is just the way that I found that works for me, because after I press it and use a bit of steam, I have a line on the inside that you can see there that helps me know where to sew. And then I just put pins in at that spot, and then I'll know where to sew my line. And now I'm just repeating that same process for the other side. And then I just cut the little slit in the back for the back opening. Now I bring this back piece over to my machine and line up my pressed dart line, sew over it, and then repeat that on the other side. This step was actually the most challenging, and that's mostly because this bias binding piece for this back opening is, I should have cut it a little bit wider than the pattern suggested because of the fabric that I'm using. Since this fabric is so fluffy, it has a tendency to fray a bit, and so that made it challenging to sew it down and get it into place. And you can actually see that I had quite a bit of trouble here, and I sewed over it a couple times. I sped this up a lot because it took me so long to put all the pins in place and make sure that it was in place as much as I could get it. Now after I sewed this piece in place, I wasn't very happy with my lines, so I actually went back over it. It doesn't look great, but at least I know that it's secure. Now I'm at the step where I get to sew the shoulder seam. Because this fabric is not slippery at all, I didn't use pins here, and I found that it stayed in place just fine. So I stitched one shoulder seam together and then repeated it for the other side. Now I'm attaching the bias binding to go around the neck and act as a tie for the back. I pressed this earlier but didn't film it. I really like these clips for situations like this where I just need that edge. I found them really handy for this. So I am just clipping all around that and then going to take it over to my sewing machine to sew that down. And next I very carefully folded over this neck binding and clipped it in place. Used lots of clips to make sure it stays in place. And as I sewed the tie and the neck binding piece, I was making very sure that those folds stayed in place and that I was getting my stitch lines just in the right spot. And on both of the ends of the ties, I folded in that very bottom piece and made sure I had a nice clean edge. And I think it turned out pretty good. Now that my neck binding is complete, I can move on to the rest of the construction. And here I'm sewing both of the side seams. And then after sewing the side seams, I sewed the sleeves. So now I'm working on the edge of the sleeve. I'm creating a channel that will have the drawstring go through it. And what I did was fold over about an inch, then fold in that seamed edge so that my tie can go through after I sew it. And now I'm just stitching down about half an inch in around the entire sleeve edge so that I will have a channel to put my drawstring through. And after preparing my sleeves, I made the drawstrings that will go into them. Then once both drawstrings were sewn, I used a small safety pin to turn them right side out. And then next I tied off one of the ends on both of the drawstrings and then cut off that frayed end piece. And then again, using my safety pin, I inserted my drawstring into the channel of both of my sleeves. And then I removed the safety pin and tied off the other end. Now both sleeves are done. And then my next step is to sew around the bottom hem. And all I did for this was fold up about an inch around the entire bottom edge of the top. And then I sewed around it. And then just to make sure that my seam was nice and secure, I did a second stitch just above that, about 1/4 of an inch, just to make sure that my bottom hem looked nice and neat. My very last step was to set in my sleeves and stitch them down. I did that very carefully and it actually went pretty smoothly. After I stitched the sleeve down, I went back over that seam with a zigzag stitch. And now the top is all finished. Now it's time to turn it right side out and see how it's turned out. And I absolutely love it. The pattern was pretty easy to work with. I love this fabric, the texture and the feel of it. And I love the print that I did on it, and it fits wonderfully. The sleeves are definitely my favorite part. I'm really glad that I made that bit of a change and added the channel instead of the buttonhole. And I love that simple back tie as well. Yeah, so I love the fabric. It's so comfortable. I'm so glad that I printed it with my stamps. I feel great in this top. I'm so glad that I made it. Well, thank you so much for watching. I hope this video was helpful. And if you liked it, please do give it a thumbs up and subscribe if you'd like to see more videos like this.